for brevity, is arguably the most potent single cost challenge to human well-being across nearly 200 countries. No time in the world has such a single event displaced our lives, our lifestyles, and our livelihoods like this. People talk about precedents, World War II. They talk about the Spanish flu and the Great Depression. But these were all confined to certain sectors. This is a single source vector which has sort of coursed through our lives, our lifestyles, our habits, our networks, our ways of doing business. And this is the kind of challenge we are facing now. This is on top of a global trade and economic challenge which came in the months preceding, basically what is called the US-China trade wars and what the magazine economists call globalization, looking inwards into nations and the slowdown of the whole philosophy of globalization, which started a very long time back. So the question now that to ask is that the economic landscape, the architecture of our trade networks, our travel patterns, our service transactions, even our social behaviors and networks will continue to be a function of the ebb and flow of this pandemic. That much is very clear to us. So I was just, Vasu here, our aviation partner is here. I was just thinking, there's a new technique called looking at night lights on maps, on Google Maps. The intensity of night light over a country or a region reveals the intensity of economic activity. And after 6 months, if you look at the flight tracker apps which are there on our phones, and you see the way the planes are flying, you will get a good idea about whether the world is back in business, what is called transnational interconnectedness. And that's completely broken now. And that's one premise we'll have to live with for the next couple of months at least. So nobody knows what is going to be the shape of the economic landscape now. I mean, there are a lot of inspired guesses. There are firms like ours, all the Big Four and the McKinseys, which put out these things which come on a WhatsApp. I thought 3 days back in the Indian Express, the ex-WEF chief, Claude Smarja, had a very good pithy commentary about it. What he said was, we are just beginning to fathom the shape of the post-COVID economic and geopolitical landscape. In other words, nobody knows yet. But one thing I know, and here also I want to give you a caveat. There's a lot of speculative thinking in what I'm going to say, and a lot of it are my views, and these are not KPMG's official views. So I think that the contours of the economic landscape will be dependent globally on 3 factors. And these factors are important for 2 reasons, especially for those of you who work in Kerala. I know a lot of the audience today is from within the state, because our enterprises, a lot of it are more open to the world than, say, other parts of India. And secondly, a lot of our enterprises are in sectors which have been very badly hit by the crisis, like tourism, like leisure and hospitality and service provision. So that is the reason why these variables are so important. Of course, the main one is the ebb and flow, as well as the potency of the pandemic. Now, the potency of the pandemic is very important because we've seen that the mortality rates of this pandemic are much lower in India than in the temperate world. That is the first main factor. We all know that. The second main factor is the reactions of national government in terms of lockdowns, containments, and other controls on economic activity like export bans on critical medical equipment. That's the second big vector which we should look at. The third one is the one which is really worrisome, and this is the combined effect, the sigma effect of national reactions, how international cooperation evolves, how leaders rise above national boundaries, and how global institutions like the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF, and the WHO lead the thinking process globally, the narrative globally, and the actions. Here we have a number of challenges. Frankly, we have few global leaders whose trust networks extend beyond their national boundaries. Without getting into specific personalities, you know that Mr. Trump has made the US unwind their outward-looking strategy apart from his other shenanigans. So this is the kind of the fact that we do not have global leaders who can knit the whole world together in these powerful countries is a big worry for people who want the global business currents to flow again. Also, a lot of these global institutions have become very effete. Even a rock star institution like WHO is under attack. Their chief has been blamed for being slow on his feet. The US has withdrawn their funding, etc. And one good thing here is somebody put it out all over the place, you've seen it, that countries where there are women leaders, like Chancellor Merkel, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, the lady in Finland, they have done much better, not just in terms of recovery from COVID, but in terms of managing the economic challenges. So what's happening is that as a consequence, global supply chains are getting disrupted. Economic nationalism has been rising in Europe in the last 2 or 3 years in the US. In the absence of pan-national leaders, so people are asking, is this the beginning of the end of what is called the Washington Consensus, where all the, except for a few countries, everybody agreed on certain key axioms like letting private sector energies flow, etc. Are we at a time in our lives when we have to do a lot of re-engineering and reimagination of international institutions, how countries should cooperate, etc. And the pandemic has taught us one thing. If you want to protect the safety of your loved ones in your house, it is not enough to look after their health. You have to look after the health of the community, the village, the city, the town, the state, the country, and the world. Because what happens in Wuhan is transmitted over railway and air networks within 1.5 months to Kochi or to Bombay or Delhi. So that is the lesson. Unless you have global security, and that's not just boundary security, unless you have global health security, you and your family are not safe in your homes and hearts. So that is the broad way in which, these are the broad challenges which we are facing when we look at this pandemic, flowing on a daily basis, and we look at our TV screens in the evening. The data has become so important about the flow of this single cause event. There are so many predictions that dwell on its spread and flow. I'll just draw your attention to one which came 2 days back, and many of you would have seen it. The Singapore University of Technology and Design has done a number crunching. And that is based on two conditions which are very, very difficult to satisfy. That is based on no lifting of controls and a severe discipline continuing for the year, and based on the numbers of the first stage of the pandemic alone. As you know, except Singapore, New Zealand, and a few other countries, we are all in the first stage. That study says that this will abate globally by November of this year, and by India by August of this year. But given the fact that we cannot continue this lockdown forever, given the fact that at some point the lockdown mortality curve will match the COVID mortality curve in countries like India, where there are so many poor and migrant laborers, this is an assumption we cannot carry forward. And I think after that, there will be a graduated lifting of the lockdown. So the point I'm trying to tell you is 2020 is an annus horribilis for us. It's a year of misery. And we have to grind our teeth through the year and get to the other side of it. Vaccine development is 12 to 18 months away. Even if you develop the vaccine, making it available in 230 countries, having a vaccination program, etc., is a very long haul. And then community transmission. And without going into all that. So we are going to go through 2020 limping. And that's something which businesses, apart from the immediate challenges of opening, paying wages, working capital, etc., have to be prepared for. So what are so many predictions have been made, and I'll attempt some of my own. What are the kind of permanent change, semi-permanent? We all have a habit, humanity has a habit of reverting to the median, we all revert back to the average. So that is maybe a good thing and a bad thing. I have a feeling that after some time, we will all get back into a jugaad mode, into a business as usual mode, etc. But having said that, I would think that there are certain changes which are going to stay with us for a very long time. And one is called a low-touch economy. We are not going to touch each other. We're not going to touch buttons. We're not going to touch airline seats. This will lead to changes in consumer behavior, in the consumption of travel and leisure. Now, Vasu will explain to you how, and Vivek will explain to you how those industries are going to be affected. There is going to be what I would call a global germophobia, a distrust of far geographies and of unknown locales. And today in the ET, I was reading a story that 40% of Indian restaurants are never going to open again. They're going to be in permanent lockout. That is a scary figure for those of you who are in the hospitality industry. There is going to be a pause in mobility in the short to medium term for sure. You're not going to go to fly to New York in the immediate future. There are going to be tremendous immigration controls and travel checks. You see in the beginning in the US. Travel may become very cumbersome and very expensive. I think Vasu will give you a flavor of what it's like to take a flight after a month or so. What will probably happen is that air travel may rise nationally and regionally within the Middle East, from Australia to New Zealand, etc., in fits and starts. Then another worry is that how many of Middle Eastern expatriate workers will have to return because of the slowdown, because of oil, because of the fact that host countries will become biologically sensitive to large migrant population living in camp ships. That is a real elephant in the room, which we dare not, the truth that dare not speak its name. But I think that is something which Kerala in particular needs to worry about. And this is, of course, not helped by rising nationalism, immigration fear, and xenophobia, particularly in European countries. Another trend which I personally believe in is that a lot of affluent nations will embrace what is called minimalism and defer non-essential expenditure. And that is going to hit countries like us hard, where we get a lot of European tourists. I don't know if Jose Dominic is in the audience today, but surely this is something which you guys who are in tourism would have factored in. Another thing which we are seeing, since we work closely with the government of India, is what is called the rise of strategic national manufacturing. Did you know that China manufactures 40% of personal protection equipment, PPEs, which people are looking for to battle this pandemic? Did you know that 60% of India's, you know that, I think, pharmaceuticals, the active pharmaceutical ingredients are imported from China. And India is scrambling now for self-reliance. So what's going to happen, and the work has already started, and we are involved in a very small way with the government with that, is that there is a huge drive towards what is called a national manufacturing defense strategy, where we are identifying and isolating stuff that we need to manufacture in India. It's back to make in India with a bang now. So that's one thing. Then, of course, I mentioned about the slow global pathways opening up. One more problem about air traffic resumption globally is the fact that, the lowest bar country needs to be raised. Dubai is the global transit hub of the world. How will they permit a flow through if their passengers who are coming from a country with very high incidence traverses into a low incidence country? There's so much of controls that we set up in those free transit areas. And here there's something called the prisoner's dilemma, which you know in behavioral psychology, that if you always act to maximize your own benefit, and you cannot lower your bar more than the worst country on the planet. So that is going to be a big, big factor impeding global air traffic flows. Just imagine how the Dubai transit hub is going to operate after 4 months or so on. So I don't want to prolong this. There are much more interesting stuff coming down your way. So what I want to say is and these economic after effects will follow what are 3 rising curves. One is the immediate reaction and relief phase, which we are in now, the medium phase of stabilization, and the long-term equilibrium, where we might see a slightly different economic and social landscape. What that landscape is going to be, we can only guess and make these kind of guesses now. So just a couple of long-term effects, and then I will cease my monologue. Firstly, we will have to go back to first principles thinking, focusing on sustainability, whether near total physical interconnectedness, which you enjoyed, whether the global supply chain paradigms are sustainable, and whether this is going to go forward in the long run is something to ponder. And one good thing which has come out is what is called presenceless cooperation through Zoom and what we are doing now, work from home. You saw that thing about TCS, the IT firm, has announced that permanently 75% of their workforce is going to work from home, what they're calling secure, borderless workspaces. So how many of you entrepreneurs can migrate to that model? It will save you cost. And one good thing about this pandemic, all crises have some good sides, is that people are getting used to the idea that you don't need to see your client or supplier physically every time. You can do the same thing because telepresence is so good these days. People are getting used to the idea, and that is something which all businesses need to migrate to. Another human behavioral change for the good would be this NIMBY phenomenon, not in my backyard. All of us have realized that protecting your family is not enough. The well-being of the community is central to our well-being. So I'd imagine that data-based community health surveillance, data predictions, the whole use of big data and IoT to protect our homes and hearts are going to be, I think government is also coming out with a big initiative on the back of a 1 billion World Bank loan, which you have seen in the papers, and that's the way we're becoming. So basically the way we are all actually become enmeshed in these networks, big data, AI, and predictive analytics are going to be our savior. Another thing is that global concerted leadership action is essential for our survival. Global safety nets have to be constructed, in terms of understandings between leaders, in terms of reimagining multinational institutions. After the World War II, there was a Bretton Woods conference which saw the rise of, this World Bank and the IMF, etc. We need another Bretton Woods conference traversing not just economic security for countries and people, but some kind of a global pandemic surveillance and mitigation protocol. Just imagine if that wet market episode in Wuhan had not been transmitted by the trains of people going for the Chinese New Year and by those flights from Wuhan to San Francisco, we would all be out of our homes today. And I would invite your attention to an NYT, New York Times has come out with a fabulous, mind-boggling graphic on how the Wuhan thing went across the globe. With just those red lines going across sends shudders down your spine. I will just stop this traverse with two great things which are going to come. I think finally, the much greater threat, the elephant in the room, climate change, this is a foretaste of that. And unless we deal with climate change with the same resilience, with the same uppermost in our minds thinking, with the same action as we are dealing with COVID, we will have much worse, irrevocable solutions. We have come to a point where this is nature's way of pushing back the equation, the envelope in my view, where we cannot devour a host beyond a point. The Gaia theory says that the human population is a cancer devouring the planet, and we are, in a sense, the way we gamble around the globe, the way we are consuming carbon, etc. So to put a mitigation to that, I think this is a moment of a wake up, a dawning for all of us, and this is something which I think will be ingrained in our minds in this generation. Now, way forward for India, I'll just take 2 more minutes. There is a huge debate going on about the size of the stimulus vis-a-vis the requirement of fiscal prudence. The debate is still playing out. The first tranche of the stimulus is expected in the next 2 or 3 days. I'm told that will be a modest amount oriented towards MSMEs, which is good news for those of you who are in that sector. There's a huge debate about the life-threatening impacts of lockdowns versus lifted calibration of lockdowns, because people are going to starve and die if the lockdown is not lifted. As I said, those curves are going to meet very soon. So hopefully the lockdown will be lifted in a calibrated manner. And the third thing is, even in India, we will have to rethink how people are going to consume goods and services, especially for firms like yours, which are in this field. I think there's going to be what is called a 10th-hour locavore. Before I started this call, one of our partners was telling me that he's getting better vegetables and food because he's getting food fresh from the farmers now. They're going across the supply chains and delivering to home. So we will have a tendency to minimalism, sustainable lifestyles, anti-fragility, locavorism, and more austerity. Now you realize, after 40 days in lockdown, a lot of the stuff you spend your brain bread on is complete waste. It's the 80%, 20% rule. When we get out into the sunlight, I think all of us, at least for some time, will focus on the essentials, on the meaningful in life. So this is an opportunity for us to do deep lateral thinking. Let us do that. I will end with a quote from Nietzsche, who said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." We are dealing with the hows now. Let us focus on the whys again. I now invite my partners to after all this passion and philosophy, to give us some real-time stuff on the various sectors we are focusing on. I think first to go is Atul, who will talk to us about cybersecurity and data protection in the time of COVID. Thank you.
Thanks, Elias. Very profound and very deep. Thank you so much for sharing all those perspectives. I'll just pick it up from there. And as Elias said, this is an opportunity as well, which the entire world is looking upon in terms of looking how the new normal is going to emerge. And Elias did talk upon saying newer business models emerging. One of those examples given was TCS, which is looking upon setting up completely new ways of working. And it's not just the technology industry, which is looking at it. Many of the manufacturing industries and other sectors are also coming across, relooking at the way digital technology is going to play a significant role going forward from here as we resume or as we recover from COVID-19. And what's that resulting upon in the past 4 weeks, if we get to see there has been a spate increase of cyber security attacks, which has followed upon. And it's a virtual life which we all live on the digital world. It mirrors very much the physical life which we all live in the real world. And as the attackers see all the citizens, all the countrymen, entire workforce adopting digital technologies at a rapid pace, they also tend to get more and more active on those channels to play on the unknowns, to play on the uncertainties, and to play on the lack of awareness on rapid adoption of digital technologies, which is resulting in significant increase in cybercrime. This has been a topic which over the last 2 weeks has been discussed quite extensively. It has been discussed right by the ministry at the Home Affairs. The country's head for cybersecurity has come on his own, giving guidelines on how citizens should be operating upon in a current time. In fact, the attackers went after the entire scheme which was being launched, or the initiative launched by Prime Minister's office on the contributions which every citizen could make to overcome the current crisis situations. And there were fake links which were going around, and that's when the country's head on cybersecurity really came out and talking about the cybersecurity guidelines which we should be following. So in a way, it's a awakening. It's always been there. Cyber has played a very important role, but at this point of time, we are seeing cybersecurity to become fundamental. As many of my fellow colleague partners will talk through the impact on the industry, but as digital channel adoption goes up, cybersecurity will become fundamental. We have seen challenges emerging because suddenly the workforce had to move and operate from home environments. And to be fair, when the home environments were being set upon, as a country, as a state, as a region, we were not prepared well to enable our workforce to operate in those kind of environments. And that's resulting massive issues. It's all of us in our families today are hooked on to digital technologies, multiple assets getting connected upon. We don't even realize whether the cyber hygienes which are required to be followed upon, are we able to follow? Because that was never in past such a big priority for us. In fact, I just wanted to give this example when I said the country's chief of cybersecurity has come on board and he has talked upon why everyone should be looking cybersecurity so closely. He has also gone ahead and given a reference to a website called mycyberhygiene.com. It's a website where anyone can go and look upon saying whether cyber hygiene practices are being followed or not. They are very simple practices, but some of those could be very investment oriented practices, and it gives you a complete opportunity to say what's feasible, what's not feasible. As I talked on attackers, they have been going to create multiple frauds, but they have also started going after healthcare information, and I think that's very concerning. There was a furor which happened in the country when information started going out of the patients which were identified positive COVID-19 patients. And as a country, we are still on the anvil of adopting Data Privacy Act. But at this point of time, everyone expects that data which is sensitive, which typically tends to be the financial information or healthcare information, is dealt upon very sensitively. As we were facing the pandemic, there were multiple channels through which this data was coming across, and it resulted in various different kind of issues. The society was not willing to accept some of these families whose data was coming out on these various channels. Many of these tend to be incorrect information which is going around on the digital channels. And that's where again, as a country, as a state, we are awakening to the reality that data privacy at these times is extremely important. I think some of my colleagues will even talk more as we talk through the sectors and give more perspectives around it. And not in my professional capacity, but I can share in my personal capacity. I just witnessed over the last 2 days one very similar incident where data went out. It created a lot of panic in the community where I operate upon. And then a lot of measures were to be taken just to come out of that panic where there was no reason to get panicked upon. So data privacy is another area which is becoming extremely, extremely important and particular at this moment. The last point which I wanted to highlight was there is an interesting dilemma, and I think Elias did talk upon on that. He did talk upon the paradox, the dilemmas which the world is going through. It's a very interesting dilemma which the world is also facing when it comes on to cyber security or data privacy, saying what should be prioritized. Should cybersecurity be prioritized? Should we be prioritizing these controls? I talked a lot on data privacy. Should we be prioritizing those controls? Or our priority should be focusing back on the well-being of the people who are in the industries, making sure there are relevant operational mechanisms for industries to recover and the businesses to operate upon, and then come on to cybersecurity and look upon on the data privacy. And it's a great paradox situation. It's a great dilemma situation in which many of the enterprises are finding themselves. I think the answer is really going back onto basics, saying that as we operate in our normal life, and I did use the word cyber hygiene, I will reuse that word. We all need to be familiarizing ourselves with the hygiene practices for cybersecurity to make sure in whatever form and shape we operate upon, we follow those fundamental practices. That's one basic rule which needs to be followed. The second rule which needs to be followed upon is in the digital world or in the virtual world, trust is not easy. And if you blindly trust upon anyone, then there could be significant ramifications. So raising awareness levels on basic do's and don'ts is something which is required upon. And the third one, which industry is looking upon at this point of time, is saying instead of it being a unidirectional communication, look upon on channels to open upon so that if people have any doubts, they can reach out. I just wanted to clarify this with last example, and possibly that's when I'll take a pause, is there were a whole lot of mobile apps which have went very active, which tend to capture the location of individuals and claim to be helping you to identify if you are getting into vicinity of an active COVID-19 positive case. Now, many fake applications have gone on the same platforms. And these applications tend to consume all the data which is sitting on the mobile devices today and use it for what all the incorrect purposes. Now that's where I go back to the point of saying trust. You need to trust only when you get information from reliable sources. And that's where biggest challenge will be faced upon by the mankind, because we as a country, we as a state, obviously are set of people who tend to trust or have trust very easily. But when it comes onto digital world, we'll have to reawaken ourselves to the new realities on how it operates. So that's where I'll take a pause, because I know there are many interesting topics lined up going forward from here. But just wanted to stop on saying that cybersecurity, data privacy in the new normal will become extremely, extremely important, extremely critical for the businesses to operate in whatever forms and shapes the businesses operate. And some very basic steps are required to be taken as we speak at this point of time. Thank you. Let me just take a pause there.
Thank you, Atul.
Elias,
Thank you, Atul. Participants can post their questions in the Q&A tab, and probably we'll take it after everyone does the presentation. Next, I request Vivek Agarwal, who's a partner. He would talk about the approach for the tourism industry. Over to you, Vivek.
Sorry, am I audible? Yeah. Okay. No, so thank you and good evening, everyone. I hope we were interacting in better times, but so is the situation right now. So two of the sector that I represent, seems to be at the hardest, which is the tourism and the MSME. Now, before sort of getting down into at a very high level as to what some of the industry players are looking at from a near term to midterm approach, I think it is an absolute opportune time to just put things into a bit of perspective, right? Tourism as a sector sort of contributes, and many of us would know, more than 10% of the global GDP. Now that essentially works out to be about $9 trillion. Again, sort of, putting it into a little more perspective is that agriculture, on the other hand, just contributes 6.5%, and the only sector which certainly sort of, tops tourism is around IT, which is 15 odd percent. Historically, tourism have outshined most other sectors, and the number of job creation that has happened over the course of last decade and a decade half is almost 1 in 4 new jobs were being created in the sector and the affiliated services. In India, particularly, the sector contributes pretty close to 10% of our GDP. It grew by 7 odd percent. It was a fairly healthy sector. Was a major employment generator. Some estimate, give or take, whatever it suggests, that almost 43 million to 50 million people were dependent on the entire supply chain of tourism. Now that's a fairly scary number if you look at it from a current, perspective. An industry undoubtedly the worst hit in this time of crisis. There are all sorts of estimates being put out by various think tanks, and including us, which is pointing towards a revenue loss of around $20 to $30 billion globally. But post the global lockdown, because these were some initial numbers that were trickling down. In India, particularly, we can draw a fact that India had about 30 billion in spend in foreign visitor alone last year. Given the lockdown and the curbs on international travel, which we don't see it sort of moving, at least in the mid to near term, even a 25% reduction, and we're looking at a loss of around $7 to $8 billion. An economy which was sort of coming out or was struggling pre-COVID, days, a further hit of this magnitude is something that we can all dwell as to where it will land us. There are whole host of data that is available in terms of the number of employment that it contributes and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to get down into belaboring those data. What is more important to understand is that the 4 of the top 10 countries that contributed about 65% of our revenue, and I'll come to the domestic side separately, are also the countries which are featuring among the top 10 countries reporting maximum COVID. The learning which is very clearly out of this is our source destination is going to almost not be non-existent in a short to mid term, and perhaps even in the long term. Similarly, if you look at from a domestic market, the top states, contributing to domestic tourism, both origin and destination are impacted. I mean, and these states, it is no brainer, will include Maharashtra, Kerala, UP, Ladakh, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu. Now, with the expected tampering of FTA, which is the foreign tourist arrival, the focus, we've always held this focus as a firm, and even personally, is that there should be a greater focus that needs to move towards encouraging domestic tourism. Let me just give a corollary from a Kerala point of view, right? The story in Kerala is not very different. For good reasons, it almost mirrors, what our national story on tourism is. Tourism in Kerala also contributes close to 10 or 11% of the GDP, somewhere around 140 billion to 150 billion dollar. It's ranked somewhere around 6 to 7 in foreign tourist arrivals, and what is more alarming to me, particularly if we talk about from a state point of view, is that Kerala has traditionally been high on the foreign tourist arrival and relatively lower on the pecking order from the domestic tourist point of view. Just on the chart, Kerala is positioned as number 19, from a domestic tourist arrival data. The industry sort of bounced back last year, after the floods, and recording the highest growth rate in tourist arrival in 2.5 decades. Now that was a huge amount of progress, and as a nation, we were quite excited about how Kerala is sort of progressing on the tourism landscape. But our view right now is perhaps it is staring at another turbulent time owing to what a pandemic that we are witnessing. we've always debated about the backwaters in Kottayam, Alappuzha, as a leisure destination, Kovalam, Varkala in sort of Thiruvananthapuram, and similar such micro destinations of Kerala, which has always been on the chart of the tourism industry. An uncertain time for the sector. Uh, International travel will almost be non-existent until a vaccine, as Elias mentioned, gets developed over the course of next 12 to 18 months. We even haven't added the time for distribution and administration and the psyche to change. More importantly, where it becomes safe for a large set of tourism patrons to travel. It is very important to understand, that the economic recovery on this particular sector is very much dependent on the source market. And as I've already mentioned, we are looking at fairly wide space on the source market. Going forward, and I think we've sort of spoken about enough about the challenge that exists and so on and so forth. What is that we should be doing going forward? There are two separate markets, and both have to be looked at, very differently. At a strategic level, there are few views that are emerging, in the larger tourism circle. There are beliefs that it perhaps may not be going to be a V-shape or a U-shape recovery. We may be in a start-stop mode in short to mid-term, and perhaps even touching the long-term side of it. Now, if that is the case, a huge amount of capital expenditure was already pouring into the sector, from asset building to asset monetization, so on and so forth. That is going to get definitely a hit, because liquidity is an issue, and any project which has not moved beyond a certain percentage, seeing it through the entire course is going to be a challenge. One of our panelists did mention about customer behavior and buying pattern. I think that is extremely important, and that is going to undergo significant change. Low touch service delivery is going to become a norm. You will see, more uptake on the automation, whether in terms of, let's say, the facility and the property, such as digital display, guest room automation, so on and so forth. And there's already a conversation that's going in various bodies about it. But from a local sectoral point of view, and particularly from Kerala, I think there is an immediate need to look at the product mix. It is difficult because these products have been built over the course of number of years, and all of a sudden to be able to go back to the drawing board and start looking at product mix tends to be a little challenging, particularly when you have large capital expenditures aligned to such such product. However, we are not in usual times, right? We are in unusual times. How do we build the flexibility to keep moving between different travel segment becomes extremely important. Business, leisures, and others, all of it, and each node of the entire value chain will have to look into how do they keep addressing the demand, particularly if you're getting into a start-stop mode, and different set of tourism is going to uptake than what it has been traditionally. I really want to spend a couple of minutes on changing the sort of focus on the domestic side of it. Now, it is our view that we expect business travel to restart soon. I mean, of course, not at a capacity what it used to be during pre-COVID, but definitely the uptake on the business travel is going to be a little more quicker than what it is going to be on a leisure travel. We expect that hotspots will linger in various Indian district states, may delay in opening of the entire rail flight network. But there are conversations that's happening in terms of adequate precautions to be taken, particularly on the travel. And Vasu will be speaking after me, and he can throw more light around it on the travel side. It is going to be an extremely critical element, for states such as Kerala, to change the communication strategy, widely, in a way where Kerala does have some inherent advantage on being, as a clean and safe, tourism ecosystem. Some tourists both domestically, I mean, largely domestically, will feel safer in larger branded hotels that they consider have higher standard of hygiene and rigorous SOPs. But it becomes equally important because these only form a very small percentage of the entire industry. The larger percentage, as we like to call it, is the middle layer of service providers. This habit inculcation, which typically doesn't get as much attention as one would like in the industry, needs to start almost urgently. Uh, Tourist perception today is going to make all the difference. Tourist perception of safety, not only when traveling by train, plane, or taxi, but also the destination of where they're going to visit and when are they going to visit. And it is a typical issue of cause and an effect. When it is going to come and then we start communicating, or whether the communicating strategy or the communication strategy will lead to a little more uptake in the tourist arrival is something to be debated upon. But changing a communication strategy is not something that's going to happen overnight, and hence a concerted effort, by industry at large, needs to be undertaken to change the narrative. Uh, I mentioned earlier, on the travel side, there are already suggestions of alternate empty seating on planes to maintain some social destination and other hygiene matters. I'll leave that for Vasu to speak. Uh, Another important point, and which is something that the local industry tourism that needs to debate, is providing flexible booking policies. Today, a very rote system of operations which the industry used to follow may not be the best solution. Primarily because we are going to look at very low level of absorption, and to be able to ensure that absorption at least starts moving to double digit and perhaps even more, there is a certain amount of flexibility that the entire industry needs to work upon. Options, and I'm getting into micro level because these are some of the narratives that at least at a central level and some of the other states are thinking about. The options for businesses to hold a guest deposit payment for, let's say, an extended period rather than making a refund will greatly assist the cash flow problem. Because cash flow today is in the near term is the biggest challenge that one is facing with. Another problem, I don't know whether to call it a problem or not. I think it's more of a perception issue that it is not understood by foreign tourists to be a separate state with a different standard of hygiene, welfare, and governance. What it is understood to be as good as what the nation is. So it is considered as an integral part of India, which is rightly so, and will be tarred with the same brush, at least in the near, the Middle East and the Southeast Asian tourist eye. This already reduces the tourism potential for Kerala. And will be sort of only get accentuated in a post virus situation. Silver lining in this entire approach is it is not all doom and gloom. As I mentioned, as a firm, we very, very categorically believe that going forward, and particularly over the course of next 2 years, domestic tourism will be the driver of the travel and tourism sectors as such. At a central level, Ministry of Tourism and other central agencies have been already working on spearheading some of the policies around it, and we've seen some of the narratives sort of coming out. Things like Dekho Apna Desh and other branding and communication exercise. It is only imperative that some of our leading states in the sector starts to pick up that or create its own narrative. And Kerala has always been known as a front runner in the sector to be able to build on these communication strategy that is being pushed at a central level. The good bit is, because I think there has been an early recognition of the fact of this sector being hit the hardest. They've already taken steps in the right direction. The industry is taking steps in the right direction. Some of the flagship programs that we are seeing, which is aligned to Swadesh Darshan or pilgrimage travel, is largely targeted towards domestic circuits and destination. it already constitutes about 75 to 80% of our entire traveler mix. And we believe, and our estimates suggest that by 2021, this figure can easily hover around 85 to 90%. I cannot sort of emphasize on the fact today that a push towards domestic tourism is going to be the new norm. And especially for Kerala, particularly because on the league table, it has some work to do on the domestic side of it. Fairly, on the map from a global circuit point of view, domestically it still stands at 19 and 20 overall. Now I can sort of get into the details of what each node of this entire value chain should be looking at. But I think as the entire industry should be sort of coming together, particularly on the major association, which is the WTTCI, the ITO, the FICCI, the CII, which they're working towards it in terms of ensuring there are certain cash flow incentivization that may be provided to the sector at large. And I would not go down into the detail because that is yet to come out in the market, and hopefully we will hear some more better news around it. But I just want to close my comment with few remarks. The flexibility, the adaptability, the invention, and the efficiency are four key pillars. If one has to sort of tide over, as the entire industry, one will have to look into. I'll take a pause here and ask my other colleagues to sort of come in for their talk.
Thank you, Vivek. Next, for an perspective on the aviation sector, I request Mr. Vasudevan, who's also a partner for KPMG in India, to take over.
Thank you so much, Nirmal, and thanks, Vivek. That's a good segue for me to get into. You did speak about the impacts on the tourism business in India and globally. And as all of you will appreciate, aviation provides the biggest vehicle for the tourism business globally, and that's been massively hit, as most of you have seen through statistics and numbers across geographies. It's something that we are still to come to terms with in terms of what we will eventually see as numbers by the end of this financial year, which is the immediate worry that both airports and airlines in India at least have, not to mention the fact that some of these businesses are already falling apart, are being shut down, or are going through some very painful phases of restructuring as we speak. So I think it's an irony that India is, or rather was still recently, the fastest growing aviation market in the world. A feather that we were proudly wearing on our caps for quite a few years now. In fact, China picked us just for a year last year. But if we looked at our growth as a market over the last 5 years, it was clearly the largest, or rather the fastest growing aviation market in the world. It was the third largest, continues to be, despite the lockdown, the third largest domestic market in the world. And we were soon to upstage the United Kingdom to become the largest aviation market in the world sometime next year. So all of that has fallen flat at this point, with no certainty about recovery in either traffic or business in this industry, both in India and across the world. And just to have a quick sense of what kind of numbers we're talking of in terms of impact, aviation in India is a $75 billion industry, which is slightly less than 2% of our GDP, and globally contributes to close to about 4% of the world GDP, and is estimated to be a $3 trillion industry as of last year. In India, again, talking specifically of the numbers that we have seen here, we had more than 650 commercial planes in operation last year, with more than 1,000 on order. In fact, our airlines had one of the largest order books among countries in Asia after China. And that only went to show the optimism that the industry had about the growth of this market over the next 10 to 15 years, pre-COVID. And that, I should say, remains largely intact even today in terms of what the potential is. But I think the biggest questions that are being asked today or whether the current players will be part of that journey. Is there a strong enough recovery plan, of course, supported by governments and regulators in the process, that we can rely on to help us put us back on that journey sooner than later? Kerala, of course, occupies a very special place in the aviation industry, as most of you know, being either residents of Kerala or with interest in Kerala. It has 4 international airports, the only state in the country which has the benefit of actually flying from 4 different airports within the state to any part of the world, largely through Dubai or Abu Dhabi or one of the Middle Eastern hubs, including Doha, as Elias was referring to. And that's why it makes it even more significant as an industry or a business for Keralites specifically. I think between the 4 airports, Kerala handled more than about 18 million passengers as of last year. And that's a significant chunk of traffic going overseas as well. And interestingly, Kerala airports handle more international traffic than domestic traffic. That's another unique distinction that can be attached to the Kerala aviation industry as well. Elias was referring to the scale of disruption earlier, and given these numbers, it's not difficult to imagine, even if you're not good at math, on what it has consumed as business in India over the last 6 to 8 weeks when we've been completely shut down across the country. And the other big concern is that even today as we speak, of course, there are speculations around how the opening up of the different states will happen. Kerala, of course, has shown a lot of leadership and gut to actually put in place several measures to mitigate the impacts, and was one of the first to actually set the trend in actually putting them into action. But having said that, it is still gloomy, at least insofar as the short run is concerned. There's no certainty in terms of how the industry will open up, whether the opening up of aviation businesses will be restricted to a few airports in the country, whether there's going to be a short-term and long-term plan in actually opening up assets over the next 6 to 12 months. So I think we need to keep that in mind before we can make any forecast about how fast this recovery will be. But even if there is a partial opening up of both domestic and global markets, global obviously is likely to happen much slower. I mean, will largely depend on how the domestic businesses fare, over the next 3 or 4 months, once these airports are open for business. But they are going to be subjected to new challenges. We discussed some of them between Atul and Elias and as well as Vivek. The big question is, will it really be possible for businesses to crawl back to what was business as usual pre-COVID, or will they have to necessarily come to terms with what we are now increasingly referring to as a new normal? And a large part of this will be subject to the collective ability of the industry to deal with the massive challenges or impacts that we've seen on the entire supply chain, including the logistics infrastructure. Not to mention the huge mess that we are seeing in terms of their own financial positions. And of course, on how they're going to manage attrition, which has already happened in some of these businesses, and managing people as well, who we now understand and see as being the most valuable assets, who will also have a critical role to play in this transition to recovery and to make it least painful. Again, from a global perspective, we need to understand that there are agencies which track this consistently in terms of top-line impacts. And the last number that we saw from IATA, which looks at this sector closely, was a prediction of about $320 billion in losses in revenues in the industry this year. We've already seen a loss of close to a quarter of revenues. And if that continues, that number could be higher as well. We've seen 100% closure of businesses in several markets. The ones which have reopened in the last 2 or 3 weeks in parts of Asia and Europe are seeing, again, traffic slowly come back, but again at 30-40% levels at best. which, as all of you will appreciate, is not enough to sustain this business for too long. Cargo traffic has remained largely unaffected. In fact, it's become the most crucial cog of business for this industry in the last 8 to 10 weeks, considering that it has helped carry a lot of essential cargo for people affected globally, including personal protective equipment to various markets. So international traffic, as we spoke earlier, has been the worst hit. And that's one of the reasons why we believe that the recovery in India also will be a bit slow, because we have been quite conservative in our approach so far in dealing with this massive health crisis. And we do expect the same sentiments to prevail before we can fully open up. So that's essentially going to affect at least 30–35% of the business in the industry, even if we were to come to near normal levels in the domestic business. So what are airports doing today? I think that's the next question to ask as we prepare for a gradual opening up of these airports. We have seen, I think, a lot of activity within airports, including Bangalore, Mumbai, and Delhi, where they are, in fact, now preparing SOPs for opening up these airports to ensure the fundamental need of providing passengers safety. Of course, social distancing is going to be one of those key themes and will be, in a sense, non-negotiable as a KPI for these airports. But then there's this larger implication of saying, as Vivek was mentioning earlier, of asking the question of whether people are going to feel safe to travel. One is, of course, give them the comfort of providing the infrastructure, but there is also this larger question of sentiment, or the fact that people may not feel safe to start traveling again. And that's a big bridge to cross if we have to actually see revival in this sector. There are also other questions being asked in terms of what we have ourselves seen in our lifestyles over the last 8 weeks. I think Elias referred to this. One of the big questions that we are asking ourselves, or businesses are asking themselves, is whether we need to travel as much as we used to. Do we need office spaces in the future as much as we have these days? Or is there a method to rationalize those assets, not just to save costs, but also to be more productive and efficient in the way we work, because we have now understood the real power of technology, the fact that we're able to sit in our homes and have these intelligent conversations seamlessly across the world with anybody you want. In fact, just to share my own experience, I also wear the hat of being the global lead for the airports business in KPMG. And I must be honest enough to tell you on this call that I've never had more intelligent or useful conversations with my own peers in the network as I've seen in the last 4 to 6 weeks, purely because of the power of technology that we have and the fact that you even see faces on the same screen. And we find that to be a lot more enriching in terms of quality than we've ever experienced when we used to do these discussions over phone calls in the past. So I think that is gradually changing as well. So it is going to beg the question of whether we need to travel a lot more, whether we need office spaces. And I think the immediate answer to these questions, again, is that we are clearly heading towards a new normal. And what that new normal will be is the big question that airlines and airports are wondering about today. Because these assets have been built, the fleet is already in place. The question really now is for them, as far as they are concerned, is whether those assets are going to be fully deployed or whether they're going to have to deal with a massive situation of requiring to pare down their assets and therefore find a way to cut losses as well. Let me just quickly go on to, again, other stuff that airlines and airports are doing at this point. We do know that most of them are busy trying to put in place infrastructure to deal with check-in processes, security and immigration, which are essential or statutory requirements at each airport. All airline and airport staff obviously will be required to wear PPEs mandatorily. We don't know in what shape or form, but that's an additional investment that they will need to necessarily make. In some cases, they could be supported by the local governments. There is going to be, of course, a huge campaign on ensuring that passengers are able to comply with these new norms, including using sanitizers, and they're going to be automatic dispensing points and machines across the airports that you will see as they open up, which use or provide sanitizers. There's going to be thermal screening. And as Atul mentioned earlier, I think you'll see a big role for technology as these businesses revive. And that's where a lot of investment is going to go in as well to ensure the primary objectives of social distancing, safety, and screening. And this is something that you will see uniformly across airports as we move forward. The other big challenge that airlines are going to see is that the government has already come out with certain norms for booking seats on a flight. We are hearing that they want to restrict this to 1/3 the capacity, preferably. Some of the airlines have not taken that too well because obviously it doesn't make sense economically to actually use one metal and just at 1/3 the load factor. But I think that's the new reality that they'll have to deal with in case they still need to fly. We'll have to see how that impacts bottom lines and what kind of support will be required for these airlines to remain alive. The other big question mark is asset utilization, more in the context of airports. So I think the government is also now looking at how we can rationalize use of these assets better. Airport operators themselves are considering this. For example, in Delhi, you have the benefit of having 3 terminals now. So there is now a thinking on whether all 3 terminals will need to be used given the reduced capacity or the demand for travel. So you could see a lot of these operations being bundled into one terminal, either T3 or T1, depending on operational feasibility. The other big area of business that's likely to get affected is non-aero. And all of us shop a lot, at least we become shopaholics over the last 5 or 6 years. The average spend per passenger for Indian travelers has gone up steadily in the last 5-6 years from the data that we have. But that's something that is going to get severely impacted, as you know, because of these new norms and SOPs. You're going to spend more time at the airport. You'll probably need to report 2 hours earlier now, mandatorily for you to be able to board a flight because of all the additional checks that will be required. That also means you have less time to shop things that you would normally do, including buying food and beverages or doing your retail shopping and so on and so forth. But what that means is that the airports themselves are going to see a significant reduction in non-aero revenue, which, as you know, is a significant chunk of their own top line and profitability as well. A large part of the non-aero revenue actually contributes significantly to the profitability of businesses. So just to close my views on what we're likely to see, I think, as I mentioned, the core theme is going to be on trying to make travel safe, not just safe, secure and reliable as well, which were other standard KPIs, and that won't get compromised as we go forward. The question is, who is going to bear the bill for all the relief measures that are required to keep both airlines and airports in operation for the next 12 months? And that's the minimum time frame that we are also seeing for any reasonable recovery to happen, assuming that we don't have any serious relapses of cases as we start opening up. Otherwise, I think it boils down to asking this big question of whether the cure is going to be worse than the disease. We heard this first from the US president, but as we open up, I think this question will become more and more relevant. Not that we can change anything about what we could have done or we should be doing, but it is going to haunt us as one big question. And therefore the governments, I think, including in India, particularly the Ministry of Civil Aviation and also the regulator, will probably need to work overtime to make sure that this recovery process is smooth and without too much pain. Lastly, coming down to Kerala, which I think is important for this group, we are already seeing some initiatives being put in place. In fact, this morning I was in conversation with the MD of Kannur Airport. We are working with them on a fairly large mandate for the last 8 to 12 months now. And we are discussing opportunities as well as immediate priorities and trying to recommend what needs to be done over the next 3 to 4 months. For example, we have seen, I think, multiple requests coming from NRKs. Elias referred to this briefly in his opening remarks. A huge chunk of non-resident Keralites who want to come back home to see their families or spend time with their dependents. So we are pushing the government to start operating what we call as repatriation flights. I think there will be obviously some push to have those flights operating equally between these 4 airports. One big challenge that we've had in the past with Kannur is that it's not a port of call for foreign carriers. We are trying to see if this is an opportunity for government to reconsider that policy and possibly give them an interim point of call or port of call status, which can help create capacity to bring these passengers back and also provide possibly essential services to help businesses move forward, given the huge interest that both economies have, both UAE as a principal market in the Middle East as well as Kerala. We are also trying to see if we can encourage the airports, particularly Kannur being a new airport and a gateway to North Malabar, to see if we can provide the bus services or other forms of travel arrangements to support last mile connectivity. And of course, thinking aloud in terms of saying, what can we do with the land there? For example, in Kannur Airport is blessed with about 1,000 acres of commercial land. So is it possible for us to, let's say, look at building a wellness center or a proper hospital with multi-speciality services, just to give passengers who come in the comfort of having a facility to park in if they need to be quarantined or tested or treated or screened? So we are discussing a lot of these initiatives, and I think you will see some of them have some traction in the next 2 or 3 months. And I just want to close by saying that the future is uncertain, clearly. But what we can achieve collectively as a society is something that is in our control. And the only expectation is that it has to be done with a lot more empathy and optimism. And I'm sure that we'll get over this crisis pretty soon as well. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasudevan. Probably one of the worst affected due to this pandemic would be the startup ecosystem. We are really not sure how many of them would survive the next couple of months. To talk more about the business continuity for startups, we have Prasad Unnikrishnan, again a partner from KPMG India. Over to you, Prasad.
Thank you, Nirmal. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. And I hope all of you have heard from Elias then till Vasu till now. And one of the things which I can see from your chats in the very beginning is that why don't you show your face, or why don't you show a PPT at least, so that you can concentrate. I can understand, because if you're on a soundtrack, you have to be like an Elias who speaks in a poetic way or a Shakespearean language. Otherwise, you need to have a PPT in front of you to see. So the good news for you is that I'll start with the PPT. So hope you can see my slides. Nirmal, is it?
Not yet. If you can share it.
Yeah. Is it coming now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So what I will do today is I will talk about the global ecosystem of startups. How has it got affected primarily because of this COVID? What is the domestic scenario in India? And what is the stakeholder impact? What are the key questions? And how do we go ahead, which is primarily what are the enablers which we should look at from the perspective of startups. So if you look at the global scenario, for any startups, if you want to see from the perspective of 3 parameters, one is primarily the financing, other is primarily the operations, and third is primarily the asset. Primarily for a startup is always the HR. So if I had looked at this data which I have collected in the last 2 days once we saw about the TiE conference, what it says is a simple thing. The number of, or the percentage is change in number of VC deals or venture capital deals from November 19 till February 2020. If you see globally, the figures are all on your screen. It has come down drastically. So what it means for the startups is a very important insight which you need to know, because when you're talking at a very high level on the COVID impact, and when I had conducted multiple sessions with different industries in both Kerala and Karnataka, including tourism, MSME, including TiE-sponsored industry sessions, etc., there are a lot of issues which we need to tackle and see how we want to go forward. So if you see from the venture capital deals which you are looking at, most of the startups which are funded from ABC series kind of a funding, they have less than 6 months cash left in hand to run the business. And in a scenario which is very unpredictable like COVID, how long will the lockdown continue and how soon can you start the business? This is a little bit of a scary scenario. If you look at the rest of the startups, 41% of startups globally are saying, other startups are saying, they have less than 3 months of cash left in their hands. So how do you look at from this kind of a financing perspective and go ahead? Now, what will it translate into from an operational perspective is more interesting to see. Again, I'm showcasing certain of the numbers which we have. And one thing which I want to say, and which is something which we have been always struggling today in this particular scenario of COVID, many of these data points are not available. So whatever little is available from various sources, we have tried to put in here. So that's one thing which I want to upfront tell you. So percentage of startups that have actually reduced their operation expenses are more than 60%. And if you see on the left, what I'm trying to say is 1 out of every 10 startups have cut cost aggressively by more than 60% from what they were doing till now. So that is another area which we want to look at. And again, when I'm saying about the startup and when I'm talking about operational expenses, the primary asset of startups are basically their manpower. And what it translates in a manpower scenario is what is, again, if you look at these things, 74% of the startups globally had let go of their full-time employees. And almost 50% of startups have laid off 20% of their staff globally. So this is the global scenario with which we are looking from the startup ecosystem and trying to say how you want to look at various perspectives of a revival. So first is a survival, then is a revival strategy. Before I go into that, let me take you through the startup ecosystem in India. This is just a plain simple thing which we have to look at. And we have got a couple of places in India which are basically considered the hubs of startups in India. So the overall impact is 47% of Indian startups and SMEs have got less than 1 month of cash left in hand. 27% of startups already have run out of funds. 48% startups are facing supply chain or disruption or increase in costs. 71% of startups are facing lower demand. What does it mean? So since we have already spoken, the working capital stress is already there even in the startups. And how do they end up paying their salaries? How do they end up collecting money from the end customers or consumers? How do they also manage and treat their term sheet with the venture capitalists or the funding agencies is a big issue for them. So that is the overall impact which they are trying to do. As a fallout of this, what is happening? Startups across major hubs are forced to lay off. Then certain companies in Bombay, Bangalore, etc. are pivoting new business models, how they want to do differently. I will come to that a little later. Now, if you also see this has an impact on certain other things like in infrastructure or real estate, wherein co-working spaces and incubators have started seeing fallouts. What is more important is that the growth and the late stage financing rounds, especially for startups, big startups which have come up, the VCs have either stalled it or delayed it. So these are certain key things which we have seen among the startup ecosystem in India. Before I go into the further details, I just want to throw some highlights on how was the Kerala startup ecosystem doing. And this is Kerala startup ecosystem has won the best performer state award by the government of India in the year 2018. And if you look at most of the startups in Kerala are primarily concentrated in Kochi and Trivandrum. But the positive side of Kerala is that Kerala never called Trivandrum or Kochi as the hub of startup. It is spread across all over the state. And therefore, during the lockdown, if you think only 2 or 3 locations are locked down, the rest of the locations can work. So there is an option for you to actually work from home or work from your location where this facility is provided. And if you look at that, we had actually got 10 active venture capital firms working in India, in Kerala, who had supported a lot of startups here. I'm not going to each and every detail. Why I'm telling you this is because I will tell you how this is going to impact your business going forward. The other thing which I want to say is, if you see the services model in Kerala, this is something which you need to look at from the larger perspective. Most of the startups are B2B or B2C, and most of them are primarily into a services company or a product and services company, with product focusing on 37%. Now, if you see the COVID impact, delivering a product to an end customer has been always a challenge. But if you are in a product and a service industry, or if you're in a service industry where you are delivering certain services on a digital platform, most of them have been successful. So that is the kind of a highlight which you want to talk about when you're talking about the ecosystem and the preferred model of delivery. Another thing which you want to talk about here is that most of the startups which were actually trying to deliver to B2B, which was primarily industries like manufacturing or textile or healthcare or edutech. Some of these industries have literally got affected, and Kerala has almost 27 to 30% of startups in the B2B sector, which is primarily getting affected because of those particular industries are shut down because of the lockdown. At the same time, if you look at B2C, business to customers, and business to government, B2G also, the startups which are working in this domain were able to survive because the service delivery, especially in edutech, entertainment, gaming, etc., has picked up. So these are all certain things which has helped certain kind of startups to survive in this kind of an industry, where certain other startups weren't able to do better because of their respective end customers are locked down. This is another slide which is showing about the kind of services they are providing into the sector. In Kerala, if you see, most of the startups are working in the IT and IT services sector, whereas a couple of them are working in educational sector and healthcare. Others are working in manufacturing, IoT, e-commerce, etc. One of the key takeaways which I am trying to tell here is, many of these customers, the startups, are working with a subset of a government client and a government customer. And during these struggles and this kind of a period of COVID, the major contribution or major spend primarily comes from the government, and that they will do in these sectors like healthcare, education, social sector, etc. And therefore, people who are focusing on those sectors will have a kind of a survival by the nature of the business and the kind of technology they are working on. Now, I will just go to the stakeholder-wise impact it has created across the globe and particularly in Kerala. So I'm just summing up the impact here in 5 major points. One is the startup by itself, the investors, the customers, the workforce, and the supply chain. I had already mentioned to you, 74% of startups saw their revenues decline beginning of the crisis itself, way back in November. 2/3 of them reduced their expenses in December 2019. Investors, any VCs, they will definitely look at what they want to get from the startups. Therefore, 20% in term sheets offered to startups before crisis were pulled back, and 53% slowed down, and investments plunged to a 5-year low in the startups ecosystem. If you see from the customer perspective, that's where more dangerous things are happening. 3 out of 4 startups operate in the severely affected industries. I just mentioned to you in the previous slide, wherein what is the exposure of Kerala startups in these industry sectors. Then next thing is delayed or no payments from the customers. This is going to really affect the cash flow or the working capital of the or startups. Looking from a workforce perspective, 26% of startups had to let go 60% of their employees because of this crisis. 95% of startups reduced their labor costs by cutting salaries. Now comes to one of the serious issues which Vivek was trying to tell about the logistics which he is trying to solve at the government of India level. Startups in India are primarily dependent on many of the components from abroad, not even produced in India. It includes hardware, IoT, and other things. Because of this disrupted logistics and supply chain, most of the startups are not having the required raw materials or required components with which they can proceed with their current production or current experiments which they are doing. So this is what is overall the startup stakeholder-wise impact which we can see in the startup ecosystem. Now, having said that, then what are the key questions which we have answered to talk about a business continuity? So I will put it in 4 buckets. One is the macroeconomic or policy impact. Second is about cost. Third is about revenue. And fourth is about financing. So when you look at the macroeconomic and policy impact, the first question which you should ask yourself is, what is the economic outlook for your startup in a particular sector or in a particular technology, or taking into account the larger economy of in India or a global, or if you are a local startup, what is it that Kerala is trying to do at this point of time? Am I doing what is required in the market? That's the first question you should ask yourself. Second is, how have the government policies changed, and is your business eligible for relaxations based on those policies? Startups are into various stages of maturity, and when government issues policies and regulations at several points of time, I have seen that most of them are not representing all stages of these kind of startups. So you should see which stage you are and see what you need to do and understand whether that relaxation is applicable to you, or else see what you can do to make government create certain things for you. And this is very important for you to survive and keep afloat. The third thing which I am talking about is, what is the impact on the domestic or local economy on your business? Because if you say you are a startup which is providing something which is globally, I will take a point from Vasu's discussion when he mentioned IATA, and he was mentioning about so many $1 billion of revenue loss has been projected by IATA. And I know one of the IATA has provided a contract for one of the startups in Kerala. They were doing pretty well to provide some solutions, but now it's a big question for both IATA and them whether this will be solved or not. So the impact of the domestic, local or international economy on your business is something the startups need to think. Most of the startups, they only look at from the perspective of they got a case sheet for solving a solution and they've started working on that. Rather than that, I would say from a macroeconomic policy impact, you should see what is government trying to do in the next 2 years, which are the areas they're going to invest and where the companies are trying to solve their problems. For example, work from home is a solution where most of you can pitch in for various solutions, which workforce solutions, which you can actually provide to companies. The second thing I will look at is from the cost perspective. All of you would have running contracts, even for startups which you're trying to do at various stages. Have these contracts been reviewed with suppliers to understand the liability in the event of a non-compliance from their side as well as from the your side? When I'm talking from your side, I'm saying whether you are able to deliver it, and if from their side, how are they going to pay you for a period of next 1 month, 2 months, 3 months? How are they going to stagger it? What are you going to do about it? What is the amount of disruption in your supply chain? If you are a startup which is dependent on certain components or parts from abroad, if you are already dependent on certain facilities which are being provided by a hardware acceleration or something, an accelerator which you have to go and do, but because of lockdown you cannot go there, how is it going to disrupt your supply chain? Third point on the cost is is the ability of the workforce to remotely work has been assessed, because many times all the speakers in this particular context have mentioned about new habit of living and working. So the moment you started working at home, you found a new normal. Now, most of us feel that my productivity increases only if I go to a workplace. This is also equally applicable to the startups, because that was the reason why so many incubators have been set up by different agencies like NASSCOM, governments, incubators, and sort of things like that has changed. So as a part of cost-cutting measures, can you also think of sitting or making a workforce work from their own locations, and is there a possibility of cost cut? Coming from the revenue perspective, I have already discussed a couple of points before, but I'll just brush through all those points. What is the likely business loss if you are going to have an impact on the COVID-19, and how is it going to affect your cash flows? How long will it take for your business to attain normalcy? But this is a big question. None of us can answer it now, but you should think about what are the things which you can do. Now, another thing which I have discussed, 2-3 days back, I have discussed with a couple of guys who are working in the startup ecosystem in Karnataka. What they were trying to say is that now there is going to be an increased competition and a price war strategy. Now, as a startup ecosystem and the startups sitting together in different parts of the country, can't you come together and attack this as a, I don't want to say for the lack of words, like you are coming and bullying as a group of organizations to try, we will not reduce the price. But what I'm trying to say is there a way you will say, I will not undercut myself for the sake of killing someone else's business? So is there a right way of doing it? And what is the impact on COVID on the end customers? Now, going to the financing options, this is a time when you need to have money, and how are you going to raise the capital from equity or from debt or from VC? What's the kind of model that you're going to look at? You need to be very innovative in the way you can do it. Previously, I used to jocularly say, if you do a 5-minute good TED talk, you are going to get a VC to invest. But today, that has changed a lot. They are going to see the real value in what they're going to get, and therefore you need to be very, very innovative to get or how to raise your capital. In case of assets under construction or in the build process, how much cost has it accumulated? You should look at, do you need to continue it with it? Or if you are not going to continue with it because of the disruption in the market, in the sector you're working, how do you want to look at from that perspective? So these are all key questions which you are trying to answer. Now, let me go to the interventions and policy enablers that might impact, mitigate this impact. We are not saying these are the only things, but the 4 pillars which I want to talk to you about is, first is about the financial resilience, second is about the regulatory resilience, third is about the operational resilience, and fourth is about the commercial resilience. Financial resilience, I mean, I don't want to discuss the same thing which we have already spoken about. So conserve cash is the message I want to tell you. See which are all the cost cutting areas which you want to do, and see how you want to conserve cash. One of the ideas which came up in one of the startup meetings which I had, and it is very good, which I want to discuss in this TiE and a kind of a conference and a forum, is this very simple thing. Can we create a cooperative kind of a setup for all the startups within Kerala, and say TiE or a GTAC kind of a forum can take it forward and say that we will pool in funds from those good or doing good startups, and see how you want to structure this for as a piggy bank kind of an approach, or a small banking which we had heard of RBI kind of an approach, where you can do kind of a business. Or for the Keralites, they might even know a Kudumbashri model of thrift model of collecting the money and spending, and that kind of a model which you can look at is a cooperative setup which I am proposing for you to create a financial resilience. And this would, I would say, being Kerala trying different models, this model can definitely bring in some kind of financial resilience for you to get some money for your immediate needs of your working capital. Regulatory resilience. Many of the startups, since they have not looked at from the perspective of what is a term sheet from with VC and what is the contract you are running with your end customers. They are primarily looking only from the perspective of technology and delivering the product or a service. So you need to basically look at what is these two things from the perspective of a term sheet or a contract, a term sheet with your VC and a contract with your end customers, to see what is the workaround you can do to play around with it, to see how you want to overcome if there is any contractual changes. Then comes operational resilience. In operational resilience, we have already spoken about work from home as one of the best options, including the TCS had announced some time back, a week back, that 50% of staff is going to be work from home by 2025. But what I'm asking is a different thing from you, because most of you have been sitting in one large 1,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet area, and all of you know each other. The best thing which you can use is resource sharing among startups. If you think you need to have a particular capability, but you know your friend startup has got that capability, can you do a resource sharing and see whether you can tie up with a partnership? The only thing you need to see to it is that your IP or your idea is not getting copied by the other thing. You can have an NDA or you can have an SLA or whatever it is. Just ensure that that can happen. This is another part of that cooperative setup, okay? But I'm putting it under operational resilience. Then you can also create and collaborate with your own startups, because one startup may be producing something which can be consumed by the other startups. So create a buyer-seller model between your community and try to see whether you can narrow down, if not completely overcome the supply chain shortcomings. When I'm saying that, I made a point previously saying that there are certain products which somebody would have stopped production because they don't have a particular part, but they would have got certain materials already in their warehouses or wherever they have a stock of it. Can you show it or put it on a place where there are other startups who need it to complete their product? This is what I'm trying about, buyer-seller model of startups, which can be created. These are all certain solutions which come up because the innovation which we have seen in Kerala is because of the reason of social coherence of the people coming together to solve a problem. So my all suggestion of, from that perspective, social coherence coming into picture for providing solutions. Now, the last thing which I'm talking about is a commercial resilience. When you say commercial resilience, alternate ways of delivery and alternate sectors that need solutions, because you must have identified solutions pre-COVID scenario. Post-COVID scenario, it is little different. So let me just give you some classic examples. Kerala government has widely used drones, especially by the police, for monitoring the people movement. And many states have started doing that. Kannada, for that matter, had created an app. Again, I take the point of Atul here, but from a privacy angle or a data protection perspective. However, Kannada has created this app and just worked exceedingly well for them, wherein they have identified the hotspots, they have identified the people going out, and they had created an app which will automatically send a location as well as, if not photographs, I don't know what it is we should say, of the quarantined patients, both at home and hospital, to track them. So when such scenarios happen, you need to change your commercial model by looking at what is needed in the market. So next slide, which I'm showing here, is looking at the focus sectors. Let me start by saying educational technology startups have picked up a lot through online training, through live classes, video lectures, etc., and those startups have exceedingly doing well during this period. Then comes the next one, which is primarily healthcare and biotechnology startups, which have been used extensively by all the governments across the globe who have been in the forefront to fight COVID-19. Then comes the entertainment and the gaming industry. Around 300% rise is seen in this particular industry for various solutions and options for startups to invest and do better in this particular scenario. And I am giving you a cue. Reliance, if you see, Facebook invested in Reliance even in this COVID situation, which means people know how to turn around and crisis into an opportunity. And that's the same message I want to give to your startups also. Digital payments have replaced cash because people even felt, you must have seen TikTok videos where people are washing the currency notes because they are afraid to touch the notes because they felt COVID will spread through that also. So digital payments have replaced and have gained market in this particular scenario. Another thing which we are doing now, video conferencing. Nobody was so much aware about Zoom or Microsoft tools or anything like that. Even a housewife sitting in Kerala's nook and corner watching the serials from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. on her TV. Now she is doing a video chat with her friends and colleagues, either on a Zoom or on a WhatsApp and other media. So the market for video conferencing has become so much relevant during this period, and we have enough space for startups to look at multiple solutions which are innovative in nature. Then comes social distancing. Now, what is the social distancing created? While many of us thought, and I think Elias made a statement that 40% of the restaurant industry is not going to come back because of various reasons. Now, one of the major reasons is people are afraid about whether they will contract a virus, and therefore social distancing will become a norm, or rather it has already become a norm. Then what is that model which people can survive on? I myself had an idea which I had thought long back also of starting my own cloud kitchen because I love cooking. But my wife was always against it. But now she has told Prasad this is the right time to do it because the demand for online delivery of good food is always there, even if when people are at home, because roti, makan and kapada has never changed in spite of COVID. So this is another area where startups can actually work on to do this. I'm just giving you certain focus sectors which have picked up during the COVID, which has turned around a crisis into an opportunity. So this is where you should focus on. I'm not going to take too much of time because I don't know how much more time we have. I'll quickly say what are the scenarios and how we want to look at So there are certain things which I have already mentioned from a fiscal support perspective, certain things from the government's relaxation of statutory norm perspective, then certain credit measures for business continuity, which we are talking about, and a startup funding options, which I'm going to talk about. In this, I will take only 2-3 points. One, I am trying to say, startups, your asset, like any other services company, are the people only. And when you want to go to a bank for a loan, unless otherwise you have got a huge transaction, otherwise your valuation is not so great, no bank is going to give you loan without you giving a collateral. And therefore, what I'm trying to say is that if you want to have a loan without a collateral, and if you have a good turnover of business in the last 2 years, can banks provide you a loan without a collateral by only showcasing your income tax statement or a turnover statement or your other mandatory compliance you have given to them, MCA? Can you get something like that? So these are all certain thinking points which you need to do from the credit measures. Fiscal support, I have already spoken about it. I'm not going to the details, but what you can do is, if you are own your own, unless otherwise you are in an ecosystem like an incubator of a government or some other places, you will have a lot of operational overheads like electricity, water, internet. Maybe the governments you can put up a suggestion to governments to look at that. Then if you are looking at the relaxation of statutory norms, I think Vivek is anyway sitting here. He will anyway take it to the government of India. Most of these people wanted the way in which GST is being collected today upfront when it's invoiced within that month you have to pay. Is there a way whether you can do it? Then for a specific in Kerala's perspective, many of the MSMEs and startups, you have got your tax refunds pre-GST period also still pending. If there is a way where governments can pay back all those kind of things to you, that's another thing you can try with respect to relaxation of norms. You can take it to the government. I'm not going into too much of a details about other things here. Let me move on to my last slide, Evan. I'm just skipping this and I'm going to move to the last slide now. Being a part of the government of Kerala, having worked with Kerala Startup Mission for quite some time, it would be not right on my part if I don't show you what the government has done and announced yesterday for the startup ecosystem. And many of these things you must have read, but I'm just reiterating it for you because this will help you a lot for you to go forward. Exemption of license fee. Primarily, SUM has exempted startups from paying license fee for using their facilities for 3 months. Hopefully, they should extend it for further period depending on how the COVID crisis turn out over a period of next 6 months. 3 months moratorium on the seed support if you are basically a startup who has taken money from this KSUM kind of a thing. And companies which have taken more than 1,000 square feet will be have a moratorium on the rent paid. For continuing operations, they have provided certain things like as minimum staff strength of 50% you can start operation. That's a good thing they have done. Waiver of rents, rent escalation suspensions. If it is possible, they have already mentioned that IT parks will do it. But what about other people like NASCOMs and other people? We should ask NASCOMs also to try to support them. Electricity bill reduction, IT park companies has also been provided. And the financial assistance, they are also doing certain things which they can help you with an online page and other things like. So I don't know whether it is an overall comprehensive way of putting it across, but with this limited time frame, what we could do and what we could share from the perspective of supporting startups in this COVID is what I wanted to share. That's it from my side, Nirmal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prasad, for that very elaborate presentation. I'm sure many of the startups have already got a preview. We have many questions online, but due to shortage of time, we have already overshot our time limit by 30 minutes. So we'll take up a few that is pretty relevant. Rest of it, the participants can mail it to the TiE Secretariat. We'll take it up with the KPMG team here. So if you can review a few of the questions. One, there was a question in terms of whether medical tourism is a prospective opportunity post-COVID. Do you think that's possible?
So definitely, I think increasingly product-oriented tourism is going to pick up, and medical and wellness. To my mind, whether domestic or foreign is another debate. But is going to be one of the focus area as the overseas sky opens, the overseas patrons are going to look at medical tourism seriously. It was anyway happening, but domestically as well, perhaps there is a need to combine, medical and wellness together, and particularly for states like Kerala.
Another couple of questions are on the manufacturing sector. Do you think that particular sector has what are the strategies for revival, especially non-essential products, apparels, post-COVID? Do you think there's something that they could do?
No, that's a very there is an increased focus on reducing the reliance on and I'm talking at a large scale, and of course the dynamics changes as you move to the second and third and the fourth layer of the entire manufacturing chain, right? There is an increased focus towards less reliance on input material, which we were sort of importing, and becoming more indigenized as we move along. There is a large thinking in terms of pumping in the immediate liquidity, the cost, the state cost as we put it, which is about duties, levies, and other taxes, which anywhere add, if not more, 30 to 35% of any manufacturing operation. Government to sort of relook at. And the most important factor in any manufacturing element is the factor of production, which is the land, labor, and capital, right? Which constitutes over 50% of any manufacturing unit. And each of such cost elements will have to be looked at in entirety. It's not an easy answer, and each sector will have to look at it, from their point of view. But having said that, I think the easy way that we had found, couple of years over the last couple of years, will have to undergo a massive shift. Just to quote an example, and someone did mention, the medical API and things like that. And someone gave an example as if, we are buying a frozen chapati, heating it, in our kitchen, and then sort of selling it out. So how much of the value addition are we able to do and increase that value addition percentage increasingly over the next couple of years will ensure that position than we are today.
Thank you. We'll just take one more question. This is on the people are looking at India for possibly developing a vaccine very soon. Do you think that will help us revive our economy? Do you think that's the right path?
So none of them are medical expert, and I don't want to hazard a guess there, because and we could sort of come back to you with a more targeted answer. And each country, but at a very high level, I think each country is trying for it. And it is for us to see over the course of next couple of years as to, which is that country that sort of outshines and provides and becomes the vaccine provider, for the world at large.
Thank you. We have really overshot our time. So without further ado, I request Mr. Damodar Avenur, our charter member, TiE Kerala, to conclude and provide a vote of thanks also. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a well-studied team of panelists from KPMG headed by Elias George, who's also a charter member of TiE. He gave a broad view on how things may pan out in the near future. Thank you very much, Elias. Thank you, Atul Gupta. You dealt upon cybersecurity and its importance in the post-COVID days. Vivek Agarwal, thank you very much, sir. You dwelt on the way forward for tourism, how we'll have to tweak to get ahead in the bad days. Vasudevan, thank you very much. You spoke on the what lies ahead for aviation tourism. You asked a question whether we'll have to travel anymore in the days to come. Prasad, thank you. You gave a very vivid graphic description on the status of startups, which are all prospective, and you gave a very good picture. Last and not the least, the participants who have been continuously attending these sessions, a big thank you to all of you. Tomorrow we have another session on doing business during COVID times by Rajesh Srivatsava, former CEO of JK Helen Curtis, and adjunct faculty IIM Indore at the same time. Please do join us. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you everyone for joining. Look forward to meeting you all online tomorrow for this very interesting session tomorrow. Thank you, speakers.